Soviet domination of Eastern Europe, a statement the President now says was in error. I'd like to know whether there's any real difference between the two tickets on Eastern Europe, or whether this is simply an effort by the Democrats to attract voters of Eastern European backgrounds. What would a Democratic administration do that the Republicans are not doing to foster freedom in Eastern Europe? And what would a new administration do on the question that the President declined to answer yesterday? If an Eastern European nation attempted to overthrow Soviet domination, should the United States help?
Well, there are several things we would do. The first thing we would do is to make clear consistently what the facts are in Eastern Europe. The comment that the President made that Eastern Europe was independent and autonomous from Soviet control is probably one of the most outrageous statements made by a president in recent political history. It's caused great confusion in Europe. Communist newspapers in Poland are praising the president because the statement helped give credibility to Soviet control. I'm glad the president finally apologized for that remark, but it's surprising that it took 6 days and several attempts before we finally received that apology. What we think is needed in our policies with Eastern Europe is not to deal with Eastern Europe as a bloc, as does this administration, but to deal with each country individually on its own status directly and not through the Soviet Union, to continue to identify with their aspirations for national independence, not because we are under any illusions about how easy it would be for them to become independent, but because it's important for us to identify as the nation which above all stands for freedom and independence with the aspirations of all people around the world for those same objectives. Secondly, we would push that part of the Helsinki Accords, known as Basket 3, which requires much more opening up in people-to-people contacts and informational contacts. This administration signed the Helsinki Accords, but has done practically nothing to push those agreements which would open up communications between our nation and our peoples and the peoples of Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. As a matter of fact, it was just the other day, after several weeks' delay, before they even finally appointed representatives of the administration to the commission looking into the enforcement of that provision. And finally, I think it's important that we honor people from Eastern Europe who stand as symbols of the human spirit's ability to stand up to police oppression. And I will never understand why this President of the United States refused to even receive and honor Mr. Solzhenitsyn, who perhaps above all people in the human race stands as a symbol for the ability and the strength of spirit against police oppression.
Senator Dole, your response.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned Solzhenitsyn. I checked today with his interpreter, and I understand you've never met Mr. Solzhenitsyn, neither has Mr. Carter. Now, I've had the privilege of meeting Mr. Solzhenitsyn. Maybe you shook his hand somewhere. But I want to move into the Eastern Europe sector. I'm reminded of how the Berlin Wall went up and who was in power when it went up. I think if we take a hard look at President Ford's record, rather than all the rhetoric that followed a mistake in the last debate about Poland, we'd know very clearly where President Ford not only stands, but has stood for 20-some years. I think one way to let the people in Eastern Europe know of our concern is by trade. As President Ford said, they've never really given up hope. Their government may be dominated. Their leaders of that government may be dominated by Soviet Russia. But the hearts and the minds of the Polish people, or the Yugoslavs, or the Romanians, or the Czechs, or whoever, have never been dominated. And they're good customers. You know, we have a favorable balance of trade with Eastern Europe. I think last year they exported almost $500 million worth of goods and material, and we sent in about $1 billion worth. I just wish Governor Carter had a foreign policy. He doesn't have any. Doesn't have any experience. He made some statement about Italy that bothers me because I was in World War II in Italy. My whole life changed because of my experience in Italy. I know the Italian people. I know they're God-fearing, freedom-loving people. I couldn't quite understand what Governor Carter meant in Playboy magazine. I couldn't understand, frankly, why he was in Playboy magazine. But he was, and we'll give him the bunny vote. But I couldn't understand what he meant when he said that we ought to extend a hand of friendship to the communists in Portugal and governments of France and Italy. Because by doing that, he simply invites difficulty from communist leaders in those countries. So I say, oh, we're strong, we're firm, President Ford understands, we're still at peace, we still have those same hopes and aspirations of the Eastern Europeans, and that's what it's all about. Freedom, peace, no bloodshed.
Senator Mondale.